Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Back in 2017, I noticed something was off with my hearing. I was working as a music teacher at the time, and being able to hear properly wasn't just important for my job, it was essential. At first, it was subtle. I'd miss parts of conversations if someone was standing on my right side, or I'd have to turn up the volume during phone calls. But what really caught my attention was this weird pulsing sound in my right ear. It was like hearing my heartbeat, but constant and annoying. I also started getting these random headaches, nothing too severe, but enough to make me worried. I went to urgent care first. The doctor there barely spent 5 minutes with me before declaring it was just a sinus infection. He prescribed some antibiotics and sent me on my way. When the symptoms didn't improve after the medication, I went to my primary care physician. When I told my primary care physician that I was still having hearing issues and that the pulsing sound was getting louder, they simply responded that these symptoms were consistent with an inner ear infection, which was quite common, especially after a sinus infection. When I pointed out that I'd had these symptoms for months, they brushed it off, saying sometimes these things take time to clear up. They suggested trying a different antibiotic and some decongestants. This went on for 2 years. 2 years of being bounced between medications that didn't work, while my symptoms gradually got worse. The pain started becoming more frequent, and my balance was getting sketchy. I couldn't teach guitar lessons without feeling dizzy anymore. Finally, in 2019, I managed to get an appointment at an ear, nose, and throat specialist's office. I was seen by their physician assistant, and I had high hopes that finally someone would figure out what was wrong. The moment she walked in, I could tell she wasn't taking me seriously. She had this dismissive air about her, barely looking at my medical history before starting the examination. She casually asked about my hearing loss and tinnitus, but when I tried to explain about the constant pulsing sound and balance issues, she cut me off, dismissing it as typical sinus problems that were very common for that time of year. When I explained that I've been dealing with this for 2 years and multiple doctors had tried treating it as sinus problems without success, she barely looked up from her computer. I could feel my frustration building. I had done a lot of research about my symptoms, spending countless nights on medical websites and forums. When I brought up the possibility of an acoustic neuroma, explaining that my symptoms seemed to match, she could barely contain her eye roll. She told me not to jump to conclusions, emphasizing how extremely rare acoustic neuromas were and insisting it was much more likely to be sinus-related issues. I could see her trying to hide her annoyance at my suggestion, but I wasn't backing down this time. When I requested an MRI to rule it out, she sighed and reluctantly agreed, making it clear she was just humoring what she thought was a paranoid patient. She said we could schedule one just to put my mind at ease, emphasizing again how very low the chances were of it being a tumor. The MRI was scheduled for 2 weeks later at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday. I remember being nervous but also relieved that at least someone was finally checking. The next morning at 9 a.m. sharp, my phone rang. It was the physician assistant, and her voice was completely different from our previous interaction. She spoke softly, hesitantly, informing me about my MRI results. When she told me they had found a tumor, an acoustic neuroma approximately 3.5 centimeters in size. The tremor in her voice was unmistakable. Gone was the dismissive tone, replaced by what I can only describe as shocked humility. After a long pause, I asked if it wasn't sinus problems. After all, she confirmed it wasn't and quickly added that she'd already referred me to their top neurosurgeon, who would be calling me that day to schedule a consultation. The line went quiet for a moment before she offered an apology for not taking my concerns more seriously during my visit. I responded by telling her I hoped this would help her remember that sometimes patients do know their bodies best. After that call, everything moved quickly. I had 2 successful surgeries to remove the tumor, and while I'm now deaf in one ear and have some balance issues, I'm doing great. But I'll never forget that phone call. The sound of a medical professional realizing she had almost dismissed something serious because she couldn't believe a patient might actually be right. The last time I visited the ear, nose, and throat office for a follow-up, I noticed she was spending much more time with each patient, listening intently to their concerns. My son is 15 and he's always been the gentlest soul you could meet. He volunteers at the local animal shelter every weekend, helps younger kids with their homework at the library, and has never been in a fight his entire life. That's why what happened yesterday shook both of us to our core. We adopted our dog from the shelter where my son volunteers. He's a 3-year-old mixed breed who was severely abused by his previous owners. It took months of patience and love before he started trusting humans again, and my son was instrumental in his recovery. They formed an incredible bond during those shelter visits. So when it was time for the dog to be adopted, we knew he was meant to be part of our family. The incident happened during their usual afternoon walk. My son always takes the same route through our neighborhood. It's a quiet area where most people know each other. Well, most except this one family that moved in about 2 months ago. Their teenage son had already earned quite a reputation in the neighborhood. There were rumors about him harassing other kids at the local park and even unaliving small animals, but no one could ever prove anything. I had warned my son to be careful around him, but I never expected things to escalate the way they did. My son told me everything after he came home crying, clutching our dog to his chest. He was walking past their house when this kid came running out. The kid asked if that was his dog, and my son simply replied that they were just taking their afternoon walk. Then the kid demanded that my son give him the leash. When my son refused, saying they were just walking, the kid became more aggressive. Before my son could react, this boy yanked the leash from his hands and started dragging our dog. Our poor pup was yelping in pain as this monster kept kicking him while holding the leash tight, preventing him from escaping. My son begged him to stop, telling him he was hurting the dog. The kid just laughed and mocked my son, asking if he was going to cry about it. My son told me that something in him just snapped at that moment. All he could think about was how long it took for our dog to trust humans again, how many nights we spent soothing him through his nightmares from his previous abuse, and how this brat was undoing all of that in mere minutes. He tackled the kid to the ground and punched him twice in the face before grabbing our dog. The kid was so shocked by the retaliation that he let go of the leash. My son scooped up our terrified pup and ran home as fast as he could. I was still trying to process everything he told me when the police showed up at our door. Right behind them was this woman, let's call her Karen, who immediately started screaming about how my delinquent son had assaulted her precious angel and demanding his arrest. I tried to explain that my son was defending our dog from being abused, but Karen insisted her son would never hurt an animal and demanded my son's arrest. The police officer had to ask her to lower her voice so they could hear both sides. I explained that my son had never been violent in his life and even volunteered at an animal shelter, but Karen accused him of fooling me too, pointing out her baby's bruised face and insisting on pressing charges. Just then, our neighbor from a few doors down came running toward us, still in her pajamas. She told the officers to wait because she had doorbell camera footage of the whole thing. The color drained from Karen's face as the officers reviewed the footage on our neighbor's phone. It showed everything exactly as my son had described. Her precious angel attacking unprovoked, the cruel treatment of our dog, and my son's justified response to protect our pet. The officers told Karen that based on the footage, her son was clearly the aggressor, having deliberately assaulted an animal and attempted to steal private property. Karen tried to claim the footage was fake, but the officers explained it was time-stamped and verified. They told her she needed to come to the station as her son would be charged with animal cruelty and attempted theft. Karen threatened to sue everyone involved. They arrested her son that evening. We later found out this wasn't his first offense. There were multiple complaints about him hurting animals in their previous neighborhood, but they'd always moved away before any charges could stick. Not this time, though. We took our dog to the vet immediately after. He had some bruising and was limping from the kicks, but thankfully no broken bones. The vet prescribed some pain medication and recommended an animal behaviorist to help him cope with the trauma. My son hasn't left his side since it happened. A week later, we received notice that Karen and her son were being evicted from their rental house. Apparently, their lease had a strict no criminal activity clause, and the landlord wasn't taking any chances after seeing the footage. They moved out 2 days later, but not before Karen tried to spread lies about us on the neighborhood social media group. Nobody believed her, of course. The video evidence had already made its rounds. Her son is now facing juvenile detention and mandatory counseling. The judge took one look at his history of animal abuse and decided to make an example of him. Karen tried to play the boys will be boys card in court, but the judge wasn't having any of it. Our dog is slowly recovering, both physically and mentally. He's still a bit skittish during walks, but my son has been incredibly patient, just like when they first met at the shelter. They take shorter routes now, and my son carries a pit defense spray just in case. The whole neighborhood has rallied around us, with people often stopping to check on them during their walks. I've never been prouder of my son. The incident might have forced him to act against his peaceful nature, but he did what was right, and that's what matters. I come from a family of 5, my parents, my 2 younger siblings, and me. We've always been close-knit, especially since we moved away from most of our relatives when I was young. This meant frequent flights across the country to visit family, particularly during holidays and summer breaks. I've been flying since I was a toddler, so I knew the drill. Tickets, identification, security check, gates. It was all routine. Everything changed 3 months after my 16th birthday. I remember waking up to my mom screaming at 2 a.m. The house was on fire. We barely made it out with our important documents and a few changes of clothes. The fire department later told us it started because of faulty wiring in the walls. While they managed to save the structure, the smoke and water damage made the house uninhabitable. Insurance covered the hotel for the first week, but with repairs estimated to take 4 months, we had to split up temporarily to save money. My younger siblings stayed with our aunt in the next town, while my parents moved into a tiny rental apartment closer to their workplace. I bounced between 3 different friends' houses, living out of a suitcase and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. This arrangement threw a massive wrench in my plans to get my driver's license. I've been looking forward to driving since forever, but how could I practice when I barely saw my parents? My mom's car was where I kept my learner's permit hours log, and between the chaos of moving around and their crazy work schedules to cover the extra expenses, driving lessons took a backseat. Fast forward to Thanksgiving. Our relatives on the West Coast insisted on flying us out for the holiday, saying we needed a break from all the stress. That's how I found myself at the airport security checkpoint clutching my high school ID and the official child ID my mom had gotten us years ago. The same identification documents I'd used on dozens of flights before. The line was moving smoothly until I reached the Transportation Security Administration agent's podium. She looked at my IDs with a nasty frown. She asked me how old I was, and when I told her I was 16, she immediately demanded to know where my driver's license was. When I explained I didn't have one yet, her voice took on an even more condescending tone as she questioned why someone my age wouldn't have proper identification. Her tone was dripping with condescension, and people behind me were starting to stare. I tried explaining that these IDs had always been accepted before, and that I'd flown multiple times with them. She just kept pushing, saying she couldn't understand why someone my age wouldn't have a proper license and that it was irresponsible. That's when something in me snapped. Maybe it was the months of stress. Maybe it was her holier-than-thou attitude. Or maybe it was just the absolute audacity of this woman to judge my life without knowing a single thing about it. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her, as calmly as I could, about how hard it had been to find time to practice driving since my house caught fire right after I turned 16. I explained how difficult it was to focus on driving lessons when living out of a suitcase away from my parents. The checkpoint went quiet. Even the people who had been pretending not to listen stopped shuffling their belongings. The TSA agent's face went through several interesting colors before settling on deep red. Her supervisor, who had apparently been within earshot, came over and asked if there was a problem. The TSA agent tried to explain herself, but the supervisor cut her off, stating that these forms of ID were perfectly acceptable for minors, and instructing her to proceed with a security check. The TSA agent handed back my IDs without another word, but I wasn't done. I sarcastically thanked her for the lesson in responsibility, adding that next time our house caught fire, I'd be sure to tell my parents we should prioritize my driver's license over finding a place to live. The supervisor actually cracked a smile, quickly disguised as a cough, while the TSA agent looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. When I walked through the scanner, I could hear the supervisor quietly telling the agent they needed to have a discussion about appropriate passenger interaction. My mom, who had gone through a different line, caught up with me at the bench where we were putting our shoes back on. She asked if everything was okay since I'd been held up back there. I just told her that someone had picked the wrong day to make assumptions. We made it to our gate with plenty of time to spare, and I noticed that the TSA agent had been replaced by someone else when we passed by security again. Some time ago, I landed what seemed like a dream job at a mid-sized tech company, and it was only 15 minutes from my apartment. Perfect, right? Wrong. Enter my new manager, who I'll call Mr. Thorough. From day one, it was clear that Mr. Thorough had an interesting management style. During my first performance review, he spent 45 minutes analyzing my email signature format. Not the content of my emails, mind you, just the signature. He told me my signature needed to be more thorough and insisted I add my department, extension number, and time zone. When I pointed out that everyone in the company could see that information in the directory, he just insisted we needed to be thorough, asking what would happen if the directory went down. This was just the beginning. Every task, no matter how simple, had to be documented in excruciating detail. Weekly reports that used to take an hour now took half a day because everything needed 3 layers of explanation. Once, he even rejected an expense report for not being thorough enough, demanding to know why I hadn't explained why we needed pens. When I stated the obvious, that we write with them, he insisted that we needed to add a detailed explanation in case someone didn't know that. The breaking point came during our busiest month. I've been working overtime to complete our quarterly financial reports, and I was proud of this one. Clear, concise, with all the essential data neatly organized. I even added some charts to make it more visually appealing. The response came within minutes. He sent it back with just 3 words that had become the bane of my existence. Not thorough enough? Resubmit. No explanation. No specific feedback. That's when I snapped. But not in the way you might think. Instead, I decided to give Mr. Thorough exactly what he wanted. Thoroughness taken to its logical extreme. I spent the next 2 days creating what I can only describe as the most ridiculously thorough report in corporate history. 20 pages of pure, unadulterated detail. The table of contents alone was 2 pages long. I included a detailed explanation of basic mathematical concepts, complete with historical context. The footnotes had footnotes. I added a section about why we use Arabic numerals instead of Roman numerals, with a helpful conversion chart. In the appendix, I included a complete history of our software vendor, including their CEO's high school GPA, a philosophical discussion about the nature of profit and loss, a weather report for every day of the quarter, because it might have affected employee productivity, a glossary defining terms like addition and subtraction, 3 pages of disclaimers, including one about potential alien invasions affecting our fiscal projections. I even added a section explaining why paper is white and text is black, for enhanced readability. The coup de grace? I included a dedication page thanking Mr. Thorough for teaching me the value of thoroughness. I submitted it at 4:59 p.m., just before leaving for the day. The next morning I arrived early, prepared for either my immediate termination or another demand for thoroughness. Instead, I found his response in my inbox. He wrote that it looked good but asked me to keep it simple next time. I printed that email and framed it. 2 weeks later, upper management conducted a review of departmental efficiency. Apparently, someone, not me, had forwarded my magnum opus to them as an example of our department's processes. The result? Mr. Thorough was transferred to a different division, and I got a new manager who actually appreciated concise, clear reporting. They created a new company policy about reasonable documentation requirements. These days, whenever someone new joins the department, I show them my framed email. It's become something of a legend. The day thoroughness went too far. Mr. Thorough is now working in the company's documentation department. I hear they're very thorough there. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.